Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and one of my absolute heroes and strong intellectual influences is the French politician, economist, and philosopher Frederic Bastiat. And we are going to talk about him today with someone who is a professor of economics and director of the MA in economics at the new virtual Universidad de las Hespérides. He's also a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. Nikolai Wenzel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And if there's one thing I love to talk about, it's Frédéric Bastiat.
All right. So who was he?
Well, Frédéric Bastiat he's one of the greatest economists to my mind. And some of my economic heroes also agreed with me. Schumpeter thought that, so Schumpeter was writing in the 1950s about how great Bastiat was. Murray Rothbard loved Frédéric Bastiat. He is, to my mind, one of the single greatest expositors of free market economics and economic logic, even though he was writing not quite 100 years ago.
I noticed you didn't mention Keynes. Keynes was not a big fan, I take it.
I would imagine not, because they came to different conclusions. Keynes was, to his credit, fairly well read. There's a separate topic for another time. I think all of Keynesianism comes from Keynes's misreading of Jean-Baptiste Say. So perhaps if he had read Bastiat more carefully, he would have come to bad conclusions also. But let's not be mean about Keynes. Let's be nice about Bastiat.
All right, we will. But I want to ask a question. I want to see if I'm correct about this.
Yep.
It was Keynes' error, in your view, the fact that he claimed that Say said that supply creates its own demand, when in reality, what Say was talking about is that in a situation of general equilibrium, then supply would create its own demand. But Keynes eliminated that and mistook it for the idea that whatever you produce, there's going to be a demand for it.
Exactly.
You've
awesome. Nailed it on the head.
Okay. So my economic bona fides are showing. Okay. So Bastiat was also a politician. He lived in France. There was a lot of upheaval at the time. There was multiple revolutions in France. And he's an economist. And like you said, Say came out of France. The physiocrats, Jean-Jacques Turgot, came out of France. I'm curious, what school of thought would you classify Bastiat as belonging to? I mean, was he neoclassical? Was he a precursor to Austrians? Where does he go?
So today we would probably classify him with the 19th century classical economists, maybe an extension of the 18th century classical economists like Adam Smith. But Bastiat is certainly in there with Jean-Baptiste Say, even though he was writing a little bit later. Bastiat himself had a lovely classification. He classified himself and his friend as the economists, and his friends as the economists, and his political opponents as the socialists. So right there, gaining the intellectual high ground, saying, we understand economics. And he was always a generous writer. But he had this notion that the economists were going up against the socialists because the economists were using economic logic to demonstrate the fallacies of socialism.
How would Bastiat differ? I'm going to ask you somebody before and somebody after. How would he differ from a David Ricardo? And how would he differ from a Milton Friedman?
So there are two ways really to answer that question, because Bastiat is rightly seen in liberty circles as a hero of liberty, an expositor of liberty. But many people see him as basically a super smart journalist, maybe the Henry Hazlitt of the 19th century. In fact, Henry Hazlitt took one of Bastiat's main points, what is seen and what is not seen, and translated it for a modern audience into the book Economics in One Lesson. So by many, Bastiat is seen simply as the best expositor, but not an economist in his own right. There's a recent trend of scholarship that sees Bastiat as not just a brilliant journalist and satirist and expositor of liberty, but also an economist in his own right, in the tradition, especially of Jean-Baptiste Say. So he would have differed from David Ricardo in that Bastiat was also an exponent of trade, but perhaps more on the political economy side, the institutional side. And Milton Friedman, Bastiat doesn't talk much about monetarism, although he does talk about money. And so Bastiat was really one of the precursors of Austrian and public choice theory, even though he wasn't in that category per se. If you read his biggest, perhaps most important essay, The Law, And it's not the first one I would recommend, but it's perhaps the most important. The law contains elements of public choice in Austrian economics, although it was written in the late 1840s, because Bastiat is talking about the limits of what the state is capable of doing based on its knowledge. Boom, Austrian economics. And he's also talking about the fact that the state is so easy to capture, and you get legalized plunder is what he calls it. When the state does things that would be illegal for a person to do, then we have legalized plunder, and that's a precursor to James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock.
What would you say are his unique contributions, if there are any, to economic thought?
Well, there are several, and I think perhaps the single most important one is the notion of what is seen and what is not seen. And he illustrates this in several essays, the best known of which is the broken window fallacy. Now, I should point out quickly that the broken window was also picked up in law enforcement in the 80s. This is a different concept. The law enforcement concept is that a broken window means that people will no longer care about the neighborhood, and a small crime will lead to bigger crimes. Bastiat's talking about something different. Very quickly, a kid's playing on the street. He kicks his ball into a window, and the crowd gathers, and somebody points out, well, wait a minute. The kid just created $100 worth of economic activity because the owner of the house is going to have to buy a new window for $100. And Bastiat points out, well, wait a minute. In the morning, the owner of the house had a perfectly good window and $100 that he was going to spend on shoes or books. At the end of the day, he has a broken window and he has to spend his $100 on those. So what is seen is the $100 of economic activity on the window. What is not seen is the $100 of economic activity for the shoemaker or the book publisher that never happened. So we have a wash. And Bastiat cautions us that if this were indeed the case, we could just go around destroying buildings and enrich ourselves by destroying buildings, which is in fact what Paul Krugman suggested after 9/11. After 9/11, Paul Krugman said, controlling for the loss of life, which is tragic, the 9/11 terrorist attacks would actually be good to kickstart Manhattan's building industry, which had been stagnant before then. And you see this principle of what is seen and what is not seen everywhere. Free health insurance in Europe. Well, it's free to the consumer, but somebody's paying for it. And it's being paid for out of taxes. In France, for example, free health insurance costs about 18% of salary. So we need to be careful about what is seen and what is not seen. And without getting too far into the details, going back to our friend John Maynard Keynes, this is one of the main critiques that can be leveled against Keynesianism. Hey, look over here. We're spending a lot of money. But on the other hand, that money's got to come from somewhere, whether it's debt spending, which is going to affect the bond markets, whether it's higher taxation, which is going to affect spending, whether it's inflationary printing, which is also going to have consequences. And Bastiat enjoins us to think always of the unseen effects of an economic action. That is perhaps his single most important contribution.
Who were his main 2 or 3 influences when it came to economics?
So Bastiat was self-taught. He was actually not an economist. He was a small-town judge in southwest France, and he was heavily influenced in. There were 2 strains of influence. One is Richard Cobden, the British economist who was involved in the anti-corn law leagues, which were basically an early form of anti-protectionism. There were tariffs levied by the British Isles, import taxes on wheat to protect local producers, and Cobden was in favor of free trade. Bastiat got in touch with him as early as the 1830s. So he was in his little province, and 1838, at the age of 37, Bastiat started a correspondence with Cobden. And the second influence was a group of free market economists called the Economists under Charles Dunoyer, who were in Paris. And Bastiat got his first economics article published in 1844. Here's an exciting little tidbit for you. It was published in a journal that was called the Journal des Economistes, the Journal of the Economists, which still exists today.
Oh, wow.
Under the slightly different name, Journal of Economist and Human Studies, Journal des Économistes et des Études Humaines. And you can submit to that newspaper. So 2 or 3 times now, I have been published in the same journal as Frederic Bastiat. It feels pretty cool.
That's awesome. That's wicked awesome. So you mentioned the book, The Law. And interestingly, when I bought the book, The Law, I bought it, I think, in 1999. And I bought it with Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. They were both classified as economics books. And in the back of The Law, they had the address for the Foundation for Economic Education. And that brought me to just learning so much. But I don't really think of The Law as an economics book. It seems more, it's a political philosophy making a moral argument. First of all, am I wrong to see it that way? And secondly, what are the moral arguments? Because I know even if I'm wrong that it's entirely a moral treatise, he does address the issues. So what are the moral arguments that he makes?
So you're correct, but I would modify that a little bit by saying that I see it as a political economy, or maybe a PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics treatise. I was having a talk recently with my father, who's a scientist, but worked briefly in industry. And at one point he was just talking about some economist, and he said, well, hey, Nikolai, is this guy, does he do what you do, or is he a real economist? And I paused for a moment, and I said, well, wait a minute. I study the intersection of politics and economics. And if you look at the US, the federal government controls about 25% or so of the economy. The state and local governments control about 15%. And if you throw on an extra 10% for compliance with regulation, you're at about 50% of the economy that's controlled directly or indirectly by politicians, by committees, by bureaucrats, by the electoral process. You can't understand the American economy if you don't understand the political process and politics and institutions. If you start going to Europe, the average OECD country is closer to 60%. So there's an intertwining of the two. And yes, Bastiat's The Law can certainly be read as a treatise of political philosophy, but it's also going to have economic consequences because he talks about what the law is. And I have a simple quotation. He says, the law is the substitution of a common force for individual forces. It's a lot like the John Locke argument that no man may serve as a judge in his own cause. And for Bastiat, who is also basically what we might call a minarchist, the law is the organization of force for good. So he's not an anarchist in this sense. He's closer in line with Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises in terms of the government protecting us from each other. And he says then, how can we tell if the law is fulfilling its duty or engaged in something bad? And he says, simply ask yourself, if an individual were doing what the law is doing, would that be considered a just or unjust action? So redistribution, favoritism, cronyism, corporate welfare, even welfare, he says, are what he calls legalized plunder. So sure, it's political philosophy, but he's also talking about the very organization of the legal system. And he also has, just to close up on this, because it is economics, a whole chapter on fake philanthropy. He says philanthropy is very important. I haven't dug enough into it, but I think Bastiat was very Catholic and very influenced by the notion that we needed to help our fellow men and women. But he says if you do it through the state instead of doing it yourself, that's fake philanthropy because you're using violence instead of using charity. So to that extent, the law can be seen indeed as political philosophy, but economics and politics are so deeply intertwined, and he was really talking about the economic organization of the state. So it all comes together.
I have to show you this because of the two people that you mentioned. These happen to be on my desk.
Nice.
Theory and History,
Yep.
and Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged.
Excellent. So I see we have a lot of the same readings.
I remember one of the things that there was a few things that the law just really helped to focus my thinking when it came to politics, because the way that I thought about it in the case that he makes is if I'm alone and somebody comes to take my stuff, I have every right to defend myself. Right. And I have no right to go take someone else's stuff. And then I thought, well, if I add another person and we decide to go take that person's stuff, it's still not right. And it doesn't matter how many people you add to the equation, to go take someone else's stuff is not justified. And on the flip side, if I want to enter into a mutual defense pact with one guy, that's perfectly okay. Make it 3, 4, whatever. And however many people you add to it, as long as it's for defense, it's a perfectly legitimate relationship. The other thing that Bastiat really helped me to see is when he is to address the argument, for instance, when I say, well, I don't think that the government should be funding education. And then the opponents will say, you don't want kids to be educated. Oh, that's not what I said. And he does an excellent job of making that point as well, that you claim that I don't want people educated when what I'm saying is the government shouldn't be doing it. The law, he has a phrase, I don't remember. It's far more eloquent than anything I'm capable of. But he talks about how the law basically is not a fount from which everything just springs, that it just has these, resources to spend. Now, you also mentioned the similarity with Locke, and I'm just curious, is there any evidence that Locke influenced Bastiat or that the American founding fathers influenced them when it came to his view of individual or natural rights?
Well, the honest answer simply is I don't know. But I would be surprised if Bastiat had not read Locke, because he's got a number of essays, particularly one called Property and Law, which sure sounds a lot like the Lockean proviso on property about mixing one's labor with property. And I love this essay, so I'll read all three or assign all three to my students. John Locke's Second Treatise, of course, Bastiat's essay, Property and Law, and then Rand's two essays, Man's Rights and the Nature of Government. And Bastiat has an argument in there about how property flows from the necessity of, law flows from the necessity of for survival of human beings of having property. So the institution of private property emerges from survival, and from there we get laws. So then that's the first argument. The second one is Bastiat was well read on the American experiment. So in the law in the late 1840s, so a decade before the US Civil War, he was already pointing to two fatal flaws in the American system that he thought would explode.
Let me say them, please. Let me say
Go
them.
ahead.
Tariffs and slavery.
Bingo, exactly that. And so this is a decade beforehand, and he is an astute reader of the American situation. He's, tariffs and slavery are going to blow up the American system. And he's supposed in this to point out that he knew very well that tariffs were not the level of ethical abomination of slavery, but in terms of the U.S. constitutional system, he foresaw that those two would tear things apart. And indeed, what do we see? A decade later, the Union is torn apart over tariffs and slavery.
Now, he was a politician as well, I believe. Mm-hmm. Did he have any impact on his contemporaries?
He did. And if you'll indulge me, I think it's worth going through a whirlwind tour of about 50 years of French history to understand where Bastiat comes in.
I'm all for it.
So pre-1789, you have the absolute monarchy, the Ancien Regime. 1789, and it was taught to me that the revolution in France was almost a discrete thing. 14th of July, 1789, the Bastille falls and we have democracy. But it was much more complex than that, because from 1789 to 1792, there was a constitutional monarchy. Then, in the face of foreign threats, in the face of other monarchs in Europe trying to reestablish the absolute monarchy, they got rid of the king, killed him, guillotined in January 1793. There follow 3 years of the First Republic and 4 years of the Directory, which comes down to chaos, because there are still three forces in French politics, and this matters for Bastiat 50 years later. There are three forces in French politics. There are the monarchists, conservatives who want to reestablish the old order. There are what we might call today the classical liberals, the Jeffersonians, Lockeans, Madisonians, who want to replace the ancient order of the monarchy with freedom and free enterprise. And then there's what we might call loosely the left. This was technically the Jacobins, but it's those who took the excesses of the French Enlightenment. They wanted socialism. They wanted redistribution. These are the radicals. There's chaos between 1792 and 1799. The country's on the verge of civil war again. Napoleon is brought back, first as a general, then as a consul, then as an emperor. In 1815, the First Empire falls. There's a restoration for 15 years of the old monarchy. So 1815 to 1830, fully 40 years after the French Revolution, monarchy is still an important factor in French politics. 1830, the king is kicked out because this time we have a middle class revolution. I think the king's being too conservative and we need more liberties. So there's a middle class bourgeois revolution in 1830, which brings in a monarchy for 18 years to 1848. 1848 is when Bastiat goes up to Paris as essentially what we would call today a US representative or a congressman. He goes up to Paris. And it's interesting because the revolution of 1848 established the Second Republic. And there was a tension going on still between the lingering monarchists, between the socialists who were trying to set up worker cooperatives and workshops. And Bastiat started writing about that, saying worker cooperatives aren't going to work. There's no incentive. They're going to fail. The people are going to starve. And you have, again, the liberal, classical liberal voices, the socialist voices, the monarchist voices. This is when Bastiat goes up to Paris, 1848. So he's caught up in this in this whirlwind. And there's some fascinating stories around 1849, 1850, when the people of Paris take to the streets to rebel and the army is sent out to quash them. Bastiat is going upstream through the demonstrators, apparently waving some sort of parliamentary immunity card, negotiating with the soldiers for a brief ceasefire so he can pull these workers out and render assistance to them. And he's trying to calm the situation. And Bastiat himself pointed out that he was, oh goodness, I wish we had politicians like this today. He said he was an independent, and checking my notes here, he voted for the left to preserve the liberty and the republic against the conservative monarchist forces, and he voted for the right to preserve order and security against the anarchists and the socialists. So this is, I think, the really important contribution of Bastiat, is that he was trying to forge a centrist path in an era when there were still three main political tendencies in France, again, monarchy, classical liberal, and socialist. And he found himself stuck between the two, a little bit perhaps like a libertarian today. And people will ask me, well, you're worried about the Democrats taxing and spending, so you're a Republican, right? And I say, no, I'm also worried about the Republicans taxing and spending. And there might be some good elements in both parties because I'm driven by principle rather than party allegiance. And then Bastiat is involved in a lot of the debates on spending as a congressman. He's involved in a lot of debates on tariff policy, and he's pushing for open trade. He's pushing for lower spending. And he does what he can, but unfortunately he gets sick in 1850, 1849 or so. He was reelected in 1849, got sick and had to go down to Rome because he had it wasn't clear. Most sources say tuberculosis, some say throat cancer, but he had to get out of the dampness and cold of Paris. He went down to Rome and he ended up dying in Rome in 1850. So he had a much smaller impact on French politics than you might imagine. But in those 3 years, he was a prolific writer, prolific defender of individual liberty, prolific defender of liberty against the absolute monarchy forces, but also a defender of order and liberty against socialism.
Now, what has been his long-term impact?
I think his long-term impact is in his writings. So I just checked before this. Liberty Fund is working on a publication of 6 volumes of his writings. And I had the good fortune about 10 years ago of being an outside reader for a retranslation. So I happen to speak French fluently. I grew up in France, so I was able to read some of the translations side by side. A lot of those 6 volumes are going to be things that are going to appeal to geeks like you and me, if I may lump you into that category. Things like his early correspondence with Cobden, things like parliamentary memos. But I think his greatest contribution is, number 1, the whole What is Seen and What is Not Seen series. Number 2, the law. Number 3, if I can lump together 2 books, the sophisms and the harmonies. So the sophisms, this is the same root as sophistry. He's attacking economic sophistry while pointing out that economics creates harmonies and state intervention creates division. And the final little tidbit that I'd point out, for those of you who are interested, he has a magnificent debate with Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon is the one who first coined the phrase property is theft. And Bastiat has a debate with him that could have been written last week on interest and what interest represents. And Proudhon is saying that interest is theft. There should be no interest on a loan. And Bastiat is explaining the concept of interest. So his lasting legacy, really full-throated defense of liberty, full-throated defense of limited government, full-throated defense of minimal government, full-throated defense of free trade, and all the while doing so in a campy, friendly, generous style, making fun of his opponents and reductio ad absurdum. He's a fun writer.
I'm going to ask you to do a lot of speculating with my next question. Frederic Bastiat, for years I pronounced it Bastiat because I figured with the French you get rid of the last consonant, but I was wrong. But he's transported to modern America, and he sees our politics, both the political theater stuff, but also the policy. Well, what does he think about the state of America today?
Well, two things. First of all, I would say that if anybody has channeled Bastiat today, it's Don Boudreau of George Mason University. Don was on my dissertation committee. He's also a friend, but he is a fantastic writer. I think Bastiat would be very proud of some American institutions, proud of a 200-year-old democracy, proud of the fact that Americans still have the Constitution on their lips, habits of the heart and habits of the mind and habits of the lip. That is, Americans will talk about their Constitution and constitutional constraint and their constitutional rights. At the same time, Bastiat would be horrified that this magnificent document of limited powers, if you look at Article 1, Section 8 versus everything that the federal government does today, there's a disconnect. So he would be plugging away and explaining why tariffs are a bad idea, explaining why redistribution is a bad idea, explaining why, certainly you mentioned education earlier. I find it fascinating that the Trump administration today is appealing to a 1980s. We're getting a little bit sidetracked, but this is completely relevant. There was a court case in the 1980s where Grove City College told the federal government basically that the federal government argued that the federal government had no power over activities of Grove City College that were not directly funded by the federal government. So Title IX applied only to admissions and financial aid because that's the only money that Grove City College accepted. That's what the court ruled in favor of Grove City. The congressional Democrats were furious, and they thought that if a federal institution received a cent of federal funding, then all of its activities were subject to federal review. So the congressional Democrats passed a law called something like the Reinvigorated Civil Rights Act or something. Reagan vetoed it, and the congressional Democrats passed it over Reagan's veto. Fast forward 40 years or so to where we are today, the Trump administration is using that very authority to defund Harvard and other universities. And so Bastiat would have had a field day with that, saying basically, listen, it's the principle that matters here. It's not whether there's a left or right-wing administration. It's the principle that if you get the state involved in education, the state is going to be calling the shots. And the state is not just any donor. It's a donor with a big army and lots of prosecutors. So he would be writing about that. He would be writing, and I'd like to think that he would have been as worried about the Trump administration as he was about the Biden administration, because it's a question of he was the quintessential bipartisan in favor of liberty.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned Don Boudreau, because I've been reading him for over 20 years. Not nonstop, but I first came across him more than 20 years ago, and he actually really helped shape my position on the constitutionality of immigration laws, because he had made an argument, I think it was in the Christian Science Monitor, that the federal government has no authority over immigration, according to Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And interestingly, now I, of course, can't find what I'm looking for because I've been picking things up. Oh, here it is. So about a month or so ago, I got to witness a debate between Dave Smith and Alex Nareste on immigration. And I actually got to ask a question. And my question was, where in the Constitution is it authorized that the federal government can restrict immigration? And Alex Nareste reached into his pocket and he pulls out this, which is the same pocket Constitution that I have from that Cato sent to me over 10 years ago. All right, before I let you go, last question. Why should people read Frederic Bastiat? He's this obscure Frenchman from the mid-1800s, but I personally think he's highly relevant today. Why is he relevant today?
He's relevant today because he could have been writing last week. You read some of these articles and one can stumble a little bit on the names. He's referring to Monsieur so-and-so, and he's got slightly quaint notions, and he's talking about a sou or a franc instead of talking about a dollar. But if you change those small things, he could have been writing last week. He could have been writing last week about tariff policy. He could have been writing last week about federal government intervention. He could have been talking about taxation. He could have been talking about Medicare cuts. He is the single best expositor of clear economic thinking. And so that's one reason to read him. He's relevant. He's the best. He's the clearest. He's also a lot of fun to read because he comes up with these absurd, campy examples. So there's one, the candle makers petition, which I'm sure you're familiar. The candle makers of Paris go to the parliament and say that they're suffering unfair competition. They're being ripped off by a bully who has the audacity to provide free light for 6 to 12 hours a day. And the bully is called the sun. And so the candle makers want the parliament to force households to have dark curtains, not for the full day because we believe in competition, but maybe for 6 or 8 hours a day to block the sun. And you read that and you think, oh my goodness, that is funny and it's relevant for today. And it's not just Bastiat does not just provide strong articles, but he's an entertaining way to spend an evening because he is such a crisp and fun writer. I wish I could have met him. You know, you have that college essay history, a college essay question. What historical figure would you like to spend a night with? Blah, 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 and with drinks. I thought I'd like to have dinner with Bastiat. I'd like to spend the evening with Bastiat and talk about him and talk with him about what's going on.
What about if we could have Bastiat, Hazlitt, Mises, and Rand just have a nice dinner?
That would be fascinating. Yep.
That would be great.
There were some strong personalities in there, but it would work out.
Especially Mises and Rand.
Yes.
Okay. So where can people find you and your work?
So the easiest way to find me is simply by Googling my work. I have periodic columns in the Daily Economy that AIER publishes. I try to be in there once a month, but I've been a little distracted by other pressing things. I write with some frequency for the Independent Institute. And at some point when I get my act together, when I'm not busy writing and teaching, I'm actually in Prague right now teaching for the Fund for American Studies, which has been a lot of fun, but I'm behind. I would like eventually to compile all of my popular writing onto my website. But in the meantime, a simple Google search. I've got a piece coming out in a few days on the Harvard versus Trump administration controversy that's coming out and minding the campus by the National Association of Scholars. And Google search is probably the easiest at this point.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me. I really appreciate it.
It was a wonderful pleasure, and it's always nice to be with kindred spirits who enjoy the great Frederic Bastiat. And he's buried in Rome. If you get a chance, he's buried in the St. Louis of the French Church. There are also beautiful paintings. I think they're Caravaggio's, and all the tourists are looking up for them. And every 3 or 4 years, you get some crazy classical liberal like me who's looking down to see Bastiat's funeral stone in Rome to pay tribute to him. Thank you for having me on your show.
Awesome. Thank you. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Until next time.